Hello. Our first boat is Heritage, particularly well-found cruising cutter, a Hans Christian. When you're getting in a systems frame of mind with a cruising boat, you have a different set of considerations than for a racing boat. The gear on this vessel has to be brutally strong because it's going to be exposed to conditions that are much harsher than a racing boat typically encounters. And it has to be repairable by the owner at sea, because you can't just drive down to the nearest chandlery when you're stuck in far offistan. We'll start right up at the end of the bowsprit here. There are 4 wires that come up here. The jib stay, bowsprit shroud, one on either side, and the bob stay. Begin with the bob stay. You can see that there's something wrong here with this cotter ring. Something has snagged it and pulled it open. Happens a lot with cotter rings. So when we think in terms of what's appropriate here, I think a cotter pin would be better. Now that's obvious. Less obvious is a pin that goes through the end of the bob stay fitting. We can see that it fits this hole in the jaw here well. What we can't see is the hole in the Kranz iron. Does that pin fit that hole cleanly? If the hole in the fitting is larger than the pin, then the pin will only bear on a small point. It's called point loading. And when that happens, fatigue is accelerated. The fitting and the pin will wear out a lot faster if the holes aren't closely matched. Typically on stainless, you want the hole the pin goes through to be about a 1/64 of an inch, no more, bigger than the pin. If it's exactly the same size, the pin will just freeze up in there, so it needs to be just a hair bigger. Other things that could go wrong with a bob stay, the angle of this bob stay to the bowsprit is a lot steeper than the angle of the jib stay to the bowsprit. And what that means is that this has less leverage. It has to pull harder this way in order to pull the bowsprit down to control the force of the jib stay pulling up. And what sometimes happens on the ends of bowsprits is that this fitting will get torqued. It'll be cranked inward by the bob stay. In this case, it's got a great solid landing here. It's not going anywhere, but it's a really good thing to watch for. The wood can just get completely blown out by that force on the end grain. Here's another reason why you want bob stays to be stronger than the jib stay. At this bottom end, they hit things. They also get corrosion from salt water, more than any other piece of rigging in the boat. So you want them to be extra stout. This one either hit something that was floating in the water. You can see how the rod is bent where it goes into the fitting. Or maybe someone endured a less than graceful docking maneuver. In either event, it's obvious we need to fix this because that wire is weakened where it's been, the rod rather has been weakened where it's been bent sharply. But we can improve its further chances of survival. Instead of replicating this entire unit as built originally, we can add a toggle, some link plates that would start at this bolt and come up here above the place that's likely to get hit, and that's where the rod would come to. We will shorten the rod. This will do several things. One is those link plates are then sacrificial. In case you hit something and they're damaged, it's much easier and cheaper to replace just that much than this entire bob stay. Another thing is it'll give you a pivot action because the link plates can pivot at the upper and lower bolts. If you do hit something, they're less likely to be damaged than this configuration. And a final thing is that the link plates can be sacrificial in terms of corrosion. If they wear out because of saltwater corrosion, again, they're easier and cheaper to replace than the entire rod. Back at the end of the bowsprit, we have the bowsprit shrouds, which go to the same fitting as the bob stay. And these wires get a lot less load than any other wire on the boat. But like the bob stay, they're down in the water and they're subject to corrosion. It's the last place you want to skimp on quality, and the builders of this boat did skimp on quality. This fitting, as I showed you in my shop, is a Swedge fitting. And it's the Kearney Swedge fitting, the less quality prone of the two. And to compound things even further, instead of being an eye, which would have a balanced load on the clevis pin, this one is a fork. It has half of its load taken here and half here. Unless that line, the wire, leads fair to the tang, all the load will come on one side of the fork or the other. And forks tend to wear out right there, right where they enter the fitting proper. Forked fittings will break a lot more often than eye or toggled fittings. In this case, the lead of the bowsprit shroud is at an angle down, and the lead of the tang, the stud, is about horizontal. So we have exactly that situation, an inferior swedge with a forked fitting with no toggle. It'll load up here and fatigue a lot faster than if it was fair. The solution here is really cheap and easy. Just add a toggle between this fitting and stay with a fork fitting, or even better yet, replace it with an eye fitting. This is a closer view of the kind of swedge that was used on these bowsprit shrouds, the places where they skimped on quality. You can see it's already getting rusty here, and on close examination with a magnifying glass, you'll find that there are some cracks going on in this swedge, right up in here at its base. Salt water has been driven in here, corroded the wire. When the wire corrodes, it expands, and it's literally blowing the swedge apart. This might last for years. It might break tomorrow. It's a definite replace this now or don't sleep calmly at night. Another little worry spot is this cotter ring and the clevis it's on. You remember how the bobstay clevis, or cotter ring rather, got snagged open? Well, this is just at least as vulnerable to being snagged. And if it is, this clevis would fall out if any slack came on it. So real cheap insurance is to make sure that your clevis pins always have the head up. If you lose your cotter ring or a cotter pin, you at least have some time to fix it before the thing falls out. It gives you something to do. And here's our first turnbuckle. Very nice in that it has built-in toggles, a universal joint at both ends. This can flex up and down and sideways without fatiguing the wire or the fitting it's attached to. Same at this end, toggled for flexion. It's particularly important on a bowsprit shroud, if only because someone might be standing on it to work on the jib or just be out there having a good time. One drawback for this kind of turnbuckle is that it has a closed barrel. Salt water can get in through this middle hole or into these lubricating holes, and I'll just bet this thing need a cheater bar and a pipe wrench to get it to move, because it's been all corroded inside. The way that this turnbuckle is kept from loosening accidentally is with these nuts. These clamp down against the barrel of the turnbuckle so that the threaded parts can't move, come unscrewed by themselves. It's not a reliably secure method with most turnbuckles like this. In order to get really unquestionably adequate security, you have to crank them down so hard that you impose a load trying to push the turnbuckle this way. You're preloading the turnbuckle, and in addition to that load, you have the load imposed by the wire. So in order to get security so that the turnbuckle doesn't unspin accidentally, you end up with a turnbuckle that's more likely to break accidentally. We'll see some alternative turnbuckles when we get to the shrouds, which we're going to next. This is the stuff that holds the mast up. And some people say that stayed rigs are vulnerable because if you're missing a cotter pin, as this vessel is here and here, or if a clevis pin breaks, or if any one of a number of little components fail, you could lose the rig. But I think those people have it backwards. A good stayed rig is made up of a series of simple, relatively inexpensive, easily repaired and maintained components. You, the sailor, can have a hand, literally, in assuring the integrity, the reliability of your rig. It takes $1 and a minute to replace these cotters. It takes maybe a little bit longer, but no money at all to turn the clevises around so that the heads are uphill. There's a neat, snag-free alternative to cotter pins in turnbuckles. Go down to a welding supply store and get some TIG welding rod, tungsten inert gas rod. It's type 316 stainless. Get it in the right diameter to fit in the cotter pin hole in your turnbuckle threads. Bend it into a tall, skinny C shape, with the top and bottom of the C being the same distance apart as the holes in the ends of your turnbuckle threads. Push it through those holes and then bend the ends down so they curl under and are hidden on the underside of the turnbuckle threads. A simple, one-piece, clean, semi-elegant, cotter-free solution. Both of these wires are the same diameter, 5/16. And both of the fittings are the same size, but the threads on the turnbuckle are not. This one is 1/2 inch, and this one is 5/8. Now, if you look in a design book or catalog, you'll find that either one of these sizes is acceptable for this size wire, but the 5/8 is much preferable. Turnbuckle, or anything solid, essentially a rod here, is more subject to fatigue than a flexible unit like wire. So I like to have the turnbuckles and the chain plates they attach to be at least as strong, preferably stronger than the wire, just so fatigue doesn't accelerate and wear them out before their time. And by the way, if you don't have one of these nifty caliper gauges, which you can get from a hardware store, you can make yourself a low-rent micrometer with a crescent wrench. Just open the jaws of the wrench and put it around the object you're measuring, and then measure across the gap with a ruler or a tape measure. Another little aside, when you're measuring wire, work your caliper around until you're on the high spots. The true diameter of the wire is revealed there, not on the flats in between. Any wire rope. The other thing that jumps out here is that this turnbuckle is drawn down too close together. There's just a few threads left showing here, and this one is overextended. When we replace this with a 5/8 turnbuckle, which is longer, it also is going to be too blocked, brought down too close together. What that means is we won't have any flexibility in tuning this rig. This wire already isn't tight enough, and we're going to run out of thread before it is. So we want to have the wire shorter, and that's where these fittings come in. Unlike swedges, these fittings, which are called Norsemans, here in Port Townsend we call them Norse persons, are removable and reusable. So since we know that this wire is good, after a close inspection, what we'll do is just cut it and move the terminal up on the wire, thus lengthening the turnbuckle, and then screw the fitting back onto the wire. Nice advantage of those. Besides being replaceable and convenient for jobs like this, these terminals are longer lived than swedges because you can fill them with silicone, something to waterproof the interior. Salt water won't get inside, can't get inside to corrode from the inside out as it can with swedges. When you go to look at wire rope, first of all, you want to know where it's been and under what circumstances. This boat is 8 years old, and it's been almost exclusively in northern waters. It's been very lightly sailed, so there hasn't been much corrosion from temperatures and salt water on it. There hasn't been much fatigue from just being used, cycles of loading and unloading that wear wire out. And it's been kept fairly well tuned, so it hasn't been shock loaded, banged on every time you tack, which happens with slack wires. And more than that, we know that it's domestic wire that is made in the USA, which is like cheap insurance because domestic manufacturers have to work to higher tolerances according to government regulations than imported wires do. So knowing all that, we can assume that the wire, barring unforeseen circumstances, is in good shape. But even if we didn't know that, you can learn a lot just by looking at the wire. If it has any pitting in it, little tiny pinholes in it that is caused by corrosion, it's a bad sign. If, as it goes into the terminal, it looks like it's been straightened out, like the spiral isn't as regular as it is up higher, that's a bad sign. Either the terminal was put on poorly, or the wire was overloaded, and when it gets very heavily loaded, it wants to untwist a little bit. So if you see wire straightening out going into a terminal, it's a bad sign. This is called 1x19 wire. It's, the configuration of it is a single strand that has 19 yarns, 19 pieces in it. So if one of these yarns breaks, your wire is over 5% weaker than when it's whole. Or if one of them isn't bearing a full load, your wire is accordingly weaker. So you want to check, not just to see that the wire is in good shape, not just that it has been only moderately loaded, but that there are no broken yarns and no proud yarns. That is, I can put my cheek right up against the wire and sight up it. And if any of those yarns aren't lying, taking their full share of the load, it'll stand a little bit out, a little bit of a bump. And it'll bump here, and then it goes up here, and you see another bump, another bump. If you see that happening, you know your wire is substandard. Sometimes, unfortunately, it comes that way from the factory, and sometimes salespeople will try to assure you that that's all right. Do not believe them. You paid for wire, you paid for the strength it's going to give you. Why give up 5%?